But a lot of millennials especially are getting to the age where they're like, gotta have a kid now or never. Like it's kind of reaching that point biologically, and they're in apartments that are not ideal for having a kid.
Everything in the early 80s smelled like smoke, right? You go to a restaurant, you go to the movies, you go wherever, there was a cloud of smoke. And that changed over time.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Kara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
And welcome back to the Missing Middle mailbag. We get so many great questions and comments from you all, and we're going to talk about one of them today.
But before we do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
This question comes from Charlotte Keskin and Keith. Love your pod. Been a listener for a while. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
For background, I'm an architectural designer in Toronto. I've studied the history of housing policy in Canada. I'm 28. I don't come from wealth. I have a partner, but still don't see a possibility to own a home until I can afford to build one myself, let alone afford kids or a car or most other things my parents had at my age. A point I think you missed regarding landlords was a cultural shift in market behavior by investors. Historically, the rental property was an asset that the renter paid into at a proportion to the liability and the upkeep costs, but the investor was continually contributing to the mortgage as a more secure and long-term investment. The rents have skyrocketed because investor landlords have increasingly come under the impression that the property should pay for itself with liquid profit at each month, not just in the increase of the asset value. So investors are now passing on the entire mortgage to renters for the upfront cost of the down payment from them. This is just not how this used to work and was not the social contract previously. They have gotten away with this because of the demand crunch from rapid immigration and loss of student housing investment as cover for a larger cultural shift about who pays the mortgage of the rental. This is essentially producing a locked-in state where renters can never afford their own down payment if they're paying the near full cost of the mortgage for the rental that they don't own. So there's lots to talk about there. Let's start with this, Mike. Is Charlotte right that things are worse for people her age than in her parents' generation?
Absolutely. So, Charlotte, thank you for this fantastic question. And she is absolutely right. And we could look at rental or ownership. If we look at ownership, the metric that I like to use is what percentage of your income is a family paying to have a house. And it is at the highest levels that we've seen in decades. There was a brief blip in the late 70s or early 80s where you can argue, and the boomers do argue this over and over and over again, back when interest rates were 21%, that, things were worse then. And arguably, it's pretty close, but that also lasted about 18 months. So, yeah, no question, things are so much worse for her generation than they were for mine. That young people really do have it harder. It's not in their imagination, and they're absolutely right to be mad about the situation. So, I mentioned my own situation. I'm a 47-year-old Gen Xer. I've been a homeowner for about 20 years now. I wake up every morning with a bad back, but I wake up every morning to be grateful that I didn't enter a housing market as bad as this one. So, to be honest, I'm a bit surprised that Gen Z and younger millennials aren't rioting in the street about this situation, given how bad things are out there. So you're our resident millennial on the Missing Middle. So, can you tell us, what do you think the mood's out there for Canadians under the age of, say, 40?
I agree with you that they should be crying on the streets, but they're just crying to each other, I think, and are feeling pretty hopeless. I see that all the time. I think about our producer, Meredith, who has 2 teenagers, and she's like, where are they going to live? I don't understand. And they don't have much hope. It seems like in general, if you don't already own a home, there's a lot of hopelessness unless you know that you have parents who are going to help you out at some point. That's the only way that people have any hope at this point.
It's so brutal out there, and I think the same thing. My kids are a little bit younger, but same thing. I'm like, I don't. They're going to be living here forever. I mean, there's no alternative, and that's really sad. We have all of these sort of milestones that we think of to adulthood, and it does feel like the ladder has been pulled out from now 2 generations. So I get why they're upset. I get why they're mad. And frankly, I think they should be madder than they are, to be quite honest.
As Charlotte said, like she talks about how she can't have a kid anytime soon. Like that's something a lot of people are thinking about. A lot of millennials especially are getting to the age where they're like, gotta have a kid now or never. Like it's kind of reaching that point biologically, and they're in apartments that are not ideal for having a kid. Like a lot of people are thinking about that. I believe I read something recently in the Hub that was talking about people are having fewer kids than they say they want to. And we know that as people get more educated and women have more options, that people tend to have fewer kids than they used to. But when people are saying they want this many kids and they're having this many kids, that's a problem. Like they just because they can't afford to economically, right?
The biggest driver of the decrease we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years of, a reduced number of kids, as a combination of, increased education, increased economic opportunities for women, advent of birth control. Those are the primary driving factors that probably explain, 80 to 85% of what's going on. That still leaves, 10 to 15 to 20% of other things. And absolutely, housing is that. And we've had a big shift. You and I talked about this on an earlier episode. We've had a big shift in this country, particularly in the province of Ontario, of what gets built is, shoebox condos. So, we talk about, okay, yeah, we're building 80 or 90,000 units a year, and that's the same amount that we used to build, say, 40 years ago. But the types of units are so much different. They're so much smaller. They have fewer bedrooms. They don't have front or backyards. So, you can get kind of misled by the aggregate data. So, when you look at, actual homes to raise kids in, we're building, not very many, and it's having knock-on effects on things like the birth rate.
I found this idea interesting that Charlotte wrote about there being a cultural shift in the expectations of landlords, that in the past, the landlords would be the one paying the mortgage, but now they expect the tenants to pay the whole thing. Is that true?
There's a bit of truth to it, but I think it's far more complex than that. And this is, again, where I'm going to have to play the old Gen Xer. Other than a period in the 1970s, and we can discuss that later, generally speaking, investors only buy in homes if it generates positive cash flow. And that's not new. Every Gen Xer knows this because there was a book that came out in the late 90s called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And everybody had the one friend who got way into this book, still popular, but and it stressed this idea of cash flow and real estate as an investment, and the need to generate positive cash flow, right? And this, I think it originally came out about 97. And again, like anybody my age who went to a backyard barbecue in the late 90s or early 2000s, got cornered by the one bro who would be like, hey, did you read Rich Dad, Poor Dad?
Oh, no, that would drive me bananas.
Well, and the funny, I'm mocking them, but except they did really well over the last 25 years. And instead of rolling my eyes,
at what expense? At what expense?
At what expense? Well, yeah, there is that. But, they did really, really well for the last 20 to 25 years. But it even goes earlier than that. I was looking at a book recently called How to Buy and Manage Rental Properties from 1988. And I've got a little quote here I'm going to pull up. It says, if you're buying a house for rental, the price is relatively unimportant. What is more important is the terms. If you're wealthy and can afford a negative cash flow, that's one thing. Maybe you can even use it as a tax write-off. But if you can't, you have no business buying property with negative cash flow for a rental, even if you get the house for $100,000 or $200,000 under the market value. Just it goes on and on that way. But yeah, this is, again, one of these things where you go back to the 80s, you go back to the 90s, crack open these real estate investment books, and they made it very, very clear that you should be positive cash flow at the end of the month. So it's never, again, with some exceptions, it's never really been the case that there had been this social norm that the landlord would be cash flow negative, but that would be okay because they would make it up later in the mortgage.
You mentioned that the 70s might be a time that was worth looking back on because it was a little bit different. What happened then?
Okay, so this is interesting, and this is what I just mentioned in the last quote about tax policy. I think we tend to make a mistake in this country that oftentimes, if something changes, we suggest that's a social change or driven by a social change. But more often than not, social changes are either driven by changes in technology or changes in policy, right? And so here's a quick question for you. What do you think the biggest social changes are of the last 40 to 50 years?
Women going into the workforce more?
Okay, that would be one. That would be a big change. And again, there was a lot of policy around that, and some social change as well. If I took a teenager from today, and let's say, okay, let's go back in time 40 years, and we're going to go back to like 1984, and they go, and we're walking around the street and go, okay, what seems different? I think the first thing that everybody would notice is, the lack of cell phones and lack of smartphones and things like that. That would, that's really changed society a lot. I think the thing that would surprise people most is how ubiquitous smoking was indoors. Everything in the early 80s smelled like smoke, right? You go to a restaurant, you go to the movies, you go wherever, there was a cloud of smoke. And that changed over time. That social norms changed, but a lot of those social norms were changed by policy changes, right? That, we banned smoking in restaurants. We hiked up taxes on cigarettes. We put those ugly pictures on cigarettes, So yeah, there was a lot of social change, but it was driven by policy change. Now, to actually turn this back into housing, back in the 1970s, from about 1974 to 1981, there was a program called MERB in Canada, multi-unit residential building, I think. I'm bad with acronyms, but basically what the program allowed for was, rich people, like rich dentists is always the sort of example. A bunch of rich dentists could get together and buy a small apartment building. And the MERB program allowed them to write off any losses from that building, including losses from depreciation, just the reduction of the value of the building for tax reasons. They could write that off on their personal taxes. So back in the 1970s, people would actually lose money every month, be cash flow negative. But it wasn't a social norm. It was a tax dodge. Let's be clear about that. The same way that you or I might put money in our RRSP. It was the kind of same thing. So yeah, there has been a bit of social change, but that social change, if it's there, is actually driven more by changes in tax policy, where these rich guys can't go around buying up buildings and then writing off the losses on their personal income tax.
Well, that sounds like an easy solution there, no? Like, why isn't the government doing that?
Why is it? Well, there are a lot of people who would love to bring back MERB, and actually, that was one of the suggestions. Not that our group had, but other groups have had to the federal government to how to accelerate apartment supply. It would probably work, or at least it would probably help. The challenge is it's a tax shelter for rich people, right? And the federal government kind of went the other way with the capital gains piece. So yes, it gets more apartments built, but it's arguably fairly regressive, which is why it essentially got phased out in the early 1980s.
So something did change. Like, we know that people used to have cash flow negative properties the same way they have now, but like, it seems like something changed. We know go back to when you were 20 years old, this is the same age that the writer is, rents were a whole lot cheaper than they are now for her. Like, how do you explain that, other than, I guess, there's the supply side that we always talk about it, but is there something about the landlords and their attitudes that have changed at all, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, I think, I think Charlotte nailed it in her letter. I think she's absolutely right. It's just it's a combination of increased population growth, right? So demand has gone through the roof, particularly on the international student side, but also increased immigration. Ontario also saw an inflow of people after oil prices crashed in 2015. People moving out of Alberta. So all of that happened. And then coupled with the last 20 years, we've also been really restrictive on the supply side. And some of those have been for very good reasons. Like we're really scaling back on expanding out urban growth boundaries because we're worried about sprawl. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it does make it harder to build, particularly if you're also not putting in rules to allow for more infill. And then taxes and development charges have gone through the roof. Just in the past few weeks in the city of Ottawa, we've seen development charges go up 11%. My hometown of London, Ontario, 20 years ago, development charges were $5,000 on a house. They're now $47,000. In the city of Toronto, they've gone up 2,000% in 20 years. So it's just this combination of supply and demand. It's almost like what we did, we did with smoking. Why people stopped smoking is we made it really difficult and expensive to smoke. Here, we've made it really difficult and expensive to provide housing. But there have probably been social norms changes that have happened. If it is that landlords are expecting higher levels of positive cash flow, it's probably because over the last 10 to 15 years, they've had higher levels of positive cash flow. And if something keeps happening, you probably expect it's going to keep happening in the future. So yeah, I mean, there probably have been some social changes, but the bigger, those are effects. Those are effects from policy changes, not, that people these days are somehow more greedier than they were back in the 1980s. Trust me, I lived through the 1980s. There are a bunch of greedy, rich jerks, trying to game the system back then as well. Human nature really doesn't change all that quickly.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. And thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And I'd like to thank Charlotte for that great question. We're rooting for you. We hope things get so much better for you and your generation, because you've absolutely been cheated out of the opportunities that Gen Xers like me and boomers had. So for you, Gen Z, your millennials out there, if you have any burning economic or housing questions, please feel free to reach out to us at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.